Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are now ready to begin this session. This plenary is entitled Creating Favorable Conditions for the Resumption of Negotiations while Countering the Obstacles to the Realization of the Two-State Solution. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers who have kindly agreed to share with us their available knowledge and expertise. I invite you to shine. Mr. al-Salhi, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Again, thanks committee and Chinese for this hostility of this meeting. I will start by talking about maybe a new approach to achieve peace in the region. The UN recognition of the Palestinian statehood in 29 November 2002 by an overwhelming majority of UN member states proved the international community alternatives to the two-state solution, which in fact is enabling Palestinian people to establish an independent state due to the reality of the existence of Israeli state, which has international support and recognition. However, the major cause is not only the international confirmation of the Palestinian rights to self-determination to establish their independent state, despite of its essential, but it lay in the willingness of the international community to pressure in order to achieve this goal to implement the UN resolutions and international law enforcement. The international community is closely monitoring the Israeli systemic destruction of this solution, firstly by devoting separation between the West Bank and Gaza, which starts before the internal division between the Palestinians. Secondly, through the expansion of settlements across the West Bank, including Jerusalem. As a result, the number of settlers exceeded to 630,000 settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. In addition, Israel is adopting a policy of ethnic cleansing, especially in Jerusalem, in order to bring an obvious demographic changes as well as the daily urban transformation towards the archaeological and religious sites. As well, the segregation wall on West Bank, where an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice declared that the segregation wall is illegal and so is the Israeli occupation. It all comes in light of Israel's insistence to continue the occupation and reject the withdrawal from the Palestinian state territories, which was recognized by the United Nations, plus imposing impossible conditions towards all negotiation issues, which was previously discussed over the past 20 years, and even introducing new claims such as the claim for recognition of in practice Israel as a Jewish state. Rather than structure a new international approach to deal with the situation, including using mechanisms and tools of the United Nations and its institutions in order to implement the UN resolutions and ending the occupation of the state of Palestine territory. We observe reservation to repeat the previous experiences, including a defect structure which could not be treated with the same means, as summarized in the following. The efforts of John Kerry, U.S. Secretary of State, to resume direct bilateral negotiation under the sponsorship of the United States of America. These efforts collide with the Israel's insistence to reject the commitment to stop settlements building activity and the release of the Palestinian prisoners according to the previous agreements. In addition to the rejection to recognize the 1967 borders, furthermore, the attempt to avoid any international reference obligations on that regard and replace it with what it is imposed as a failed combining on the ground by the occupation, Israeli army, force, and settlers. The repeated repetition of negotiations on previous manner will not lead to peace. In the contrary, it will continue to destroy the future of peace and the imposition of facts that prevent the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. For evidence, the following Palestinian-Israeli negotiation experiences can be addressed. First, the direct bilateral negotiations which followed Oslo Agreement were extended until 1999, in which an agreement should have been reached on the final status issues, borders, security, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, water, and prisoners. 1999 time framework was 5 years after the scenario of Oslo Accord. This experience failed miserably, and during that period, the Israelis' famous term, appointments are not sacred. Furthermore, more than one Israeli prime minister was selected and different governments from various parties were settled. However, the result remained the same. Moreover, the murder of Yitzhak Rabin and rebound the implementation of the deal during the transition phase, such as the redeployment and withdrawals from some areas, etc. And alternatively, Israel expanded settlements activity. Second, this was followed by the American active intervention in the negotiation, which is represented in the Camp David conference sponsored by the American former President Bill Clinton. This conference also has ended with object failure. Despite the unfair judgment of the late President Yasser Arafat and the direct consequences on his life, though the truth is that the introduced solution to all issues, and specifically Jerusalem, security, borders, etc., were same solutions Israel has repeatedly introduced and lead to the failure of these negotiations, with a clear accumulation represented in the lack of seriousness of Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at that time. Third, the next phase, and after the outbreak of second Intifada, stands in the setup of the quartet, which mandate was indeed assigned to task during 3 years' time frame expanded to more than 10 years, through an announced estimation of its weakness and failure to commit Israel to fulfill its obligation in the roadmap, which included unfair obligations on the Palestinian side, which were fully implemented, while Israel continued to deny its obligations and even were to contrast them, especially in the case of the settlement. Thus, it did not return the situation to what it was prior to 29 September. Despite what is said about the seriousness of the talks held by President Abu Mazen with Ehud Olmert, Israel's prime minister at that time, these talks also hit the Israeli attitude toward the issues of border, Jerusalem, and refugees. In spite of the resumption of negotiations afterwards in different names, such as Annapolis, exploratory talks, etc., it all failed. The most prominent landmarks of failure was also the failure of the mission of George Mitchell and inability of the U.S. administration to force Israel to freeze settlements effectively. Pursuing by the Obama administration retreats from demand to stop settlements and also declining its concern to pursue the peace process as a whole. Although the Obama administration has maintained its support to Israel, it backward in front of Netanyahu's political move. Add to this some modest European attempts in the context of this failure, despite the fact that some European countries tried to launch a European initiative which did not see the light of day, and the European position remained a follower of the USA position. The review of these experiments demonstrates clearly a structural defect of the negotiation process in addition to its references and setup. This can be summarized in the Israeli rejection of the UN resolution as a key reference to the peace process. Alternatively, Israel continuing its approach to make broad change on the ground as an alternative reference to the UN resolution. The US position to to support Israel was expressed in the famous letter from George Bush to Ariel Sharon in 2004, which specified considering the changes on the ground as a cornerstone in anything. To make this a new reference of the peace process as imposing give up on the Palestinian people rather than resolving some minor border issues within the framework of the recognition of the authority of the 1967 border. This goes into a significant question about the exchange of territory in an open and abstract manner which make it method to enable the status of the state. The new approach requires the evidence of UN resolutions and the insistence of Israel to ignore the role of this international organization and this institution in seriously sponsors the peace process led to ending the occupation, and insist on adherence to the direct bilateral negotiations without any reference, represent one of the main reasons of the failure of the negotiation. It raises the need for a new approach based on more intervention and international support to bring peace to the region, and this means the support of the United Nations for a new international conference for peace based on ending the occupation and implementing the UN resolutions as a reference of the peace process. Thus, that takes care of serious negotiations for the separation of the borders between the state of Palestine, recognized by the UN on the borders of June 1967 and East Jerusalem, the capital, and the state of Israel on the basis of the illegal of the settlements to ensure the power of the Palestinian state and mutual security, and as leading to the investment of the Arab Initiative as part of the overall reflecting of peace and security in the region, and on the basis of ensuring justice solution to the Palestinian refugee issue in accordance with 194 resolutions. The new approach requires the expansion of the international efforts and not confined to US efforts alone that failed as permanent Israel. No doubtly, this means invest the efforts of China, Russia, and EU to modify this reflection in order to assemble on the new alternative which was brought by the UN recognition of the state of Palestine as the Palestinian land and its borders are not a disputed land, but are the land of the state of Palestine, while the central issue is the immediate termination of the occupation of the territory of this country that joined the United Nations family of nations, and to use all means of UN laws and its institutions in order to ensure international peace and implementation of UN resolution. There is no doubt that the success of this approach is reinforced by ending the Palestinian division, strengthening the national struggle, the popular resistance to the occupation, increase the elements of Palestinian people, economic and social development, steadfastness on its native land. These are the urgent issues in front of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and all Palestinian political forces. And by this kind of approach, maybe the negotiation will take more for the substance of negotiation. We don't want again to come back for just the negotiation as meetings without results. The results is very important now more than the meeting itself. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the committee, I would like to express our deep appreciation to al-salhi for the presentation that has been made, and also to the attendance and active participation in this international meeting that is very important for any one of us, and in particular for the very important information that you are presenting on behalf of the state of Palestine. Our next speaker is Mr. Richard Wright, Director of the Representative Office of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, in New York. Mr. Wright joined UNRWA in 2012 after a distinguished career with the European Union, where he held a number of positions, including that of the head of the delegation of the European Commission to the Russian Federation, that was between 2000 and 2004, and director for conflict prevention and external security policy within the European External Action Service in 2011. We are pleased to welcome you as a panelist in this important meeting. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your introduction, and let me say that I welcome enormously the opportunity to address you today here in Beijing. The fact that we are meeting in China, geographically a very long way, of course, from the Middle East region, is a testimony to the global nature and importance of the unresolved Israel-Palestine question. Let me recall that the mandate of our agency, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, was established by the General Assembly by Resolution 302-4 of the 8th of December 1949. And we have now been operating for over 63 years. That's longer than my lifetime, and I suspect longer than the lifetime of most people here. Our continuing work on the world's most longest lasting and biggest refugee issue is a reflection of the fact that no permanent solution has been found to this protracted conflict. As time goes by, things don't get easier for Palestine refugees. As an illustration of this, let me point to the immense suffering of the Palestine refugee community in Syria, over half of whom, 235,000 people, are now displaced within that country, and 15% of whom have fled to neighbouring countries. This tragedy reminds us once again of the immensely precarious lives which so many Palestine refugees lead, and their need to draw upon their seemingly endless reserves of resilience, mutual support, and kinship to weather turbulence, upheaval, and violence. Is there an end in sight to all this? That's the task of the politicians. Services are universally available to all registered refugees living in our areas of operations, which are Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Whereas in 1950, the community of Palestine refugees that we were responsible for looking after was 750,000 people, that figure is now over 5 million. And that the refugee population is increasing by 3% annually. The services that we provide for Palestine refugees can best be described as those that would normally be supplied by a local or a national government. These services are delivered by our 30,000 staff, most of whom are Palestine refugees themselves. We have almost 500,000 children going to UNRWA schools, which are staffed by 23,000 teachers. We have 139 health centres across the region who receive 10 million patient visits per year. And we also, of course, assist the poorest and most vulnerable refugees with additional assistance, most notably food aid. Today, our agency is facing a disturbing medley of man-made crises of varying intensity in all our 5 fields of operation. And I'd like to describe in a few words exactly what those challenges are. Let me begin in Gaza, where no less than 75% of the population are Palestine refugees. The violent conflict of last November has exaggerated the already dire situation of a population which feels abandoned by the international community. The number of refugees mired in deep poverty, marginalised and vulnerable is increasing inexorably. In the year 2000, when the Gazan economy was functioning relatively normally, only 10% of the refugee population needed our assistance to meet their basic needs. Today, that figure is 70%, seven times the number in percentage terms. What has happened is that the Gazan economy has become severely dysfunctional as a result of the blockade imposed by Israel 6 years ago. The draconian restrictions on the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza paralyzes economic activity, particularly exports, which are virtually non-existent. This deepens poverty and forces ever-increasing dependence on the international community. Let me illustrate this point. Over two-thirds of the Palestine refugee population of 1.2 million people, two-thirds, 827,000 people require food assistance from UNRWA. This costs around $93 million this year. If the trends continue for the future, it's going to cost, of course, much more. Secondly, 60% of Palestine refugee youth is unemployed. When account is taken of the fact that there are many people who do not even bother to register for work, the unemployment is probably over 80% of this young generation. We try to improve, of course, this situation, and UNRWA spent over $400 million in Gaza in 2012. But unbelievably, this amounts to 16% of Gaza's GNP, and we provide jobs for about 8.2% of the working population. A report by the UN in 2012 called Gaza 2020 set out in the starkest possible terms the future outlook for Gaza. The message was very clear. In the absence of sustained and effective remedial action and an enabling political environment, the challenges confronting the people of Gaza will further intensify in the coming years. UNRWA alone will be called upon to provide services for an estimated 400,000 additional refugees by 2020. In what is already a very overcrowded and highly urbanized area with one of the highest population densities on the planet. So living conditions will inevitably deteriorate further. Just this year, for example, we need to build between 6 and 8 schools to house to provide education for another 7,000 to 8,000 school children. By 2020, the UN report said there would be virtually no reliable access to sources of safe drinking water, and standards of healthcare and education will further decline. And this means also that the high number of poor, marginalized and food insecure people, depending on assistance, will increase. As we've heard today from a number of speakers, an immediate step change is needed in Gaza to reverse these deteriorating trends. And let me suggest, as others have suggested, that opening up Gaza for legitimate exports would be a start in the right direction. Also, we would like to see substantially reduced delays in importing goods and building materials for our projects in Gaza. We have to wait 29 weeks on average to get endorsement by Israel for our projects. We'd also like to see a reduction in the costs of our importation. We estimate that we spend a staggering $5 million a year, that's almost 1% of our total general fund, in additional costs in importing goods. And let me state the obvious, you can buy a great deal in Gaza with $5 million. So this money is wasted, but it is imposed on us, these costs. Let me now turn to the West Bank, where, as others have said earlier, restrictions and barriers imposed by the occupying powers stifle the economic activity of the Palestinian population. Continuing settlement expansion and growing settler violence are also having a serious impact on some of our UNRWA's more vulnerable beneficiaries. As illustrated, for example, in our report that we issued recently called Al-Jabal, a study on the transfer of Bedouin and Palestine refugees. I really recommend that you have a look at this. This was a detailed anthropological study conducted by UNRWA with an Israeli NGO, BIMCON, and it documented in detail the tragic effects of the forced removal of 150 Bedouin families, mostly Palestine refugees, in 1997 to a rehousing scheme located by the Jerusalem rubbish dump. The study showed that the social cohesion of this mobile, pastoralist community was destroyed, as well as their traditional culture, way of life, and their economic base. And let me underline that there's a serious risk of further displacement of Palestine refugee Bedouin communities from the E1 area in the West Bank. One should not forget either that many Palestine refugees who have been displaced from their land in the West Bank and impacted by the checkpoints, preventing them reaching their marketplace or their agricultural land, hospitals, schools, all of which have had a very negative impact on the lives of the refugees. A few more words now about the conflict in Syria, which tragically is unraveling the entire fabric of the Palestine refugee community there and enhancing refugees' vulnerability. 7 out of 12 UNRWA refugee camps are now battlegrounds, with most of the residential populations there put to flight. In other words, they've run for it. And we've repeatedly called on both sides of the conflict to respect humanitarian and human rights law and to refrain from offensive operations in civilian areas. Regrettably, these urgent appeals have not been heeded by either side. The consequence of this is that UNRWA now needs to assist the entire Palestine refugee population of 530,000 persons, which is about 530,000 persons. 15% of these, as I mentioned earlier, who've now fled to neighbouring countries, so to Lebanon, where we estimate there are now 60,000 Palestine refugees, to Jordan, where about 7,200, and also to Egypt, where there may be as many as 10,000. Some refugees have also gone to Gaza. Many of our installations in Syria have been destroyed or damaged. 6 UNRWA staff members have been killed, not to speak of the very large number of casualties amongst the Palestine refugee population. Education of children has been badly disrupted. Over 50% of Palestine refugees, students, have been prevented from getting access to schools and education facilities. And let me underline here that this is, if you like, a perhaps less well-known aspect of this conflict. What is going to happen to these children who lost the opportunity for an education? So the needs of refugees, Palestine refugees in Syria, are escalating very fast. We appreciate the very important support we received from donors, but what we have received will not be enough to help us overcome the next phase of this emergency. And in the new Syria humanitarian and regional response plans launched 10 days ago in Geneva, UNRWA has requested an additional $200 million for the next 6 months. 350 million of this for Syria, 44 million for Lebanon, and 4 million for Jordan. This is a doubling of the request of the previous 6 months, which in its turn was a doubling of the request of the previous 6 months. So we now have a situation where the emergency support that we need for our refugee community is 8 times what it was 18 months ago. Let me say a few words now about Lebanon, where we have registered Palestine refugee population of 440,000, probably less than that living there, but there are heightening tensions in overcrowded refugee camps as a result of the Palestine refugees fleeing from Syria, which, as I said earlier, is over 60,000 people. We are therefore working hard to alleviate the further pressure on our camps and on our services in Lebanon. And you can see that the much feared spread of the conflict is impacting the Palestine refugee community there. In Jordan, which is in many ways a more stable field of our operations, there are also mounting tensions and a massive influx of refugees which are having spillover effects on the population there. 2 million Palestine refugees in Jordan, and poverty is rampant in the refugee camps. We estimate that about 7,500 Palestine refugees have gone to Jordan from Syria. This very brief overview of the challenges in our 5 fields of operation shows that we are confronted, on the one hand, with the need to to cope with the mounting impact of these crises, and at the same time to continue to provide our core health, education and relief and social services to an ever-expanding Palestine refugee population. Now, meeting these two goals will only be possible if UNRWA gets the necessary voluntary support from UN member states, which are the source of 97% of our funding, so we get very little funding from the UN budget as such. The reality is, however, that the financial environment in which we operate is worsening and is hampering our ability to meet our objectives. To illustrate this, let me draw your attention to the fact that we are facing a deficit of $65 million, about 10% of the total budget of $663 million on our core budget, the budget that pays for the health, education and social services. If we hadn't received a contribution from the UK government at the end of 2012, we wouldn't have been able to pay the salaries. This year we're faced with an even more significant deficit, and this hand-to-mouth existence is a serious problem for us, and it's imperative that we take longer-term measures with our donors to shore up UNRWA's finances and put them on a more stable footing. So, as things stand now, we're going to run out of cash in October, and if we run out of cash, we won't be able to pay the salaries of our 30,000 staff. So we're faced with a very serious challenge again. How do we raise this deficit of $65 million? We're also not working in a static environment. As I explained earlier, our population is increasing all the time, roughly 3% a year, as are the costs of fuel, food, medicine, utilities, and also staff salaries, which are linked to the salaries of the host countries. So this deficit of 65 million is going to be a deficit of 100 million plus next year, and even greater the year beyond that. So what can we do about this? A process of reflection is underway to try and see if we can find a more stable base for our work. We've stepped up our fundraising efforts with non-traditional donors such as the BRICS, and this has resulted in very welcome new contributions, for example, from Brazil, which gave us $7.5 million last year, with another $7.7 million this year expected in the form of in-kind food aid. Russia, which has become a contributor to the agency for the first time this year with a $2 million donation. India has been a regular contributor with $1 million to UNRWA for some time, and we're looking to deepen our ties with that country, and China has doubled its contribution to $150,000 this year. OIC country contributions are more generous today than they used to be. Saudi Arabia is one of the most generous donors and recently pledged a very large $86 million for infrastructure projects, making its total contribution this year to UNRWA about $120 million. We're very grateful to Kuwait, which stepped in with a very large contribution of $15 million to our efforts to meet humanitarian needs resulting from the crisis in Syria. However, above all, and let me emphasize this point, we need greater support for our general fund, our core budget, which finances our core programs. And we hope very much that Arab League countries will redouble their effort to meet the Arab League's own target to fund just under 80% of our general fund. Amongst the Asian countries, I'd like to recognize Malaysia's very important contribution of $1.25 million to UNRWA last year, and to note also the Republic of Korea's intent to increase its contribution to UNRWA to double it to almost $500,000 this year. However, despite these welcome developments, Asian countries' overall contributions to UNRWA's budget are small. If one excludes Japan, which has contributed a very large sum to UNRWA since 2000, the contribution of other Asian countries to UNRWA's core budget stands at just 0.2% of the total. Now, if we accept that the problem we're dealing with is a global one, this figure can only be described diplomatically as suboptimal. So we're looking to Asia to increase its support to the agency in the next few years and to maintain that effort by making multi-year commitments. So we would, of course, welcome more Asian members of UNRWA's advisory committee, and the qualification for this is to contribute $15 million to UNRWA over 3 years. And our overall hope is that Asian countries' contribution to UNRWA, including Japan, will increase to at least 4% of the general fund in the near future. In closing, let me underline that the international community needs a strong UNRWA. The alternative, a strong erosion of UNRWA through a process of death by 1,000 cuts, will destabilize the Palestine refugee community at a time of great uncertainty in the Middle East, and when renewed efforts, as we heard earlier, are being made to relaunch the Middle East peace process. Such an erosion of UNRWA would not only be politically exceptionally unwise, but it would also throw the burden of caring for the refugee community onto host countries, none of whom is in a position to cope. It would also add to the multiplicity of other tensions in the Middle East. So in concluding, my message is that if you agree that now is not the right time to weaken UNRWA, nor to undermine its stabilizing humanitarian function in the Middle East, then please give serious consideration to strengthening global, regional and national efforts to shore up the agency's finances and put them on a sound basis. In short, UNRWA must be backed until a just and durable and fair solution is found to the question of Palestine refugees in accordance with United Nations resolutions. The political stakes in all this are very high, and I count on your support. Thank you for your attention.
We express our thanks to Mr. Wright for his presentation, also for this very important contribution in relationship with the obstacles and shortages that UNRWA is facing in his work, in particular taking into account the importance of this activity for we providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian refugees. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker, that is Mr. Ahmad Tibi. He is Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, where he represents the Arab Movement for Change, a party he helped establish, named by Israeli newspaper Haaretz as one of the 50 most influential figures in the last decade. Mr. Tibi has served during his parliamentary work on a number of committees, including those dealing with the interior, finance, women's issues, the environment, as well as law and the Constitution. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like again to thank the United Nations for this important gathering. And I will start by mentioning 3 events that took place this week. The first was the declaration by Danny Danon, Deputy Minister of Defense of the Israeli government, saying that the Israeli government will not agree and is not agreeing for the two-state solution. The second was the yesterday declaration, similar, by the Minister of Economy, Naftali Bennett, saying that the two-state solution is ended, there will be no Palestinian state, and we should build and build and build more settlements. The third event was tonight, when an Arab village inside Israel called Abu Ghosh was attacked by Israeli Jewish terrorists called price tag. Usually in the Israeli press and the Israeli policy, only Arabs are being called terrorists. Usually when they are a Jewish terrorist, there is another name. It is called price tag. Price tag, it is to say that this is a revenge that Palestinians started, and this is the price tag. But we are talking here about systematic, day by day attack by Jewish terrorists, settlers usually, against Palestinian villages from both sides of the Green Line in the occupied Palestinian lands in 1967 and inside the State of Israel against villages and towns of Arab citizens of Israel. Tonight, 30 cars were destroyed and slogans were written there, racist slogans against Arab and Palestinians. I mentioned these three events in order to say that this is triangle or is connected. For the last 17 years, the PLO and the government of Israel are negotiating on-off for the implementation of the vision of two-state solution, based principally on 1967 borders. But to say the truth, the ordinary Palestinian citizen feels today that in some aspect of his life, things are worse than was before. Freedom of movement, the continuous control of the Israeli occupation on more than 60% of the land, called sea land, the sea land, sea areas, and the no hope, no horizon in the last years of a real success or real breakthrough in the negotiating process. I do believe that Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of the Israeli government, is very willing. He really wants to meet with President Mahmoud Abbas. He asked to meet with President Abbas always, day by day, when publicly and when he meets with Secretary Kerry or any other visitor to his office. But that's it. He only wants to meet and to talk, to have dialogue, to continue talking, to continue have dialogue, to negotiate, and to continue the same process that was there for the last 17 years. Photo op. But to say the truth, and I told President Mahmoud Abbas, who is refusing to give Mr. Netanyahu this tool of photo op because it's counterproductive. To have a photo with Mr. Netanyahu these days, it is very much hazardous. I prefer other photos. But to meet in order to implement the agreements, for example, to meet after Mr. Netanyahu will freeze the settlement. For example, when Mr. Netanyahu is saying that President Mahmoud Abbas is putting preconditions, it is a mistake. Freezing settlement, freeing Palestinian prisoners, or negotiating for an independent Palestinian state based on 67 borders are not preconditions. It is there in the roadmap. These are not preconditions. Who is putting a precondition to the established Palestinian state? Prime Minister Netanyahu, by saying that the PLO should accept Israel as a Jewish state in the end step. It is very strange when you are strong, already existent state will ask a non-existent state or a newly supposedly state to recognize you as a Jewish state by ethnic definition. Usually, a new state anticipates that the rest of the world, mainly the neighboring first states, will accept this state. Here we are talking about a very strange, made in Israel fashion as a precondition to create an independent Palestinian state, to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And why President Abbas and the PLO are saying no for this precondition? Because if the PLO will accept, and it will not accept Israel as a Jewish state, two things will occur. First, there will be no need, no place to discuss the refugee issue, even on the table, to put it in the table. Because Israel will be a Jewish state accepted by the PLO, by the Palestinian people. The second, those who I represent and being elected by the Arab minority in Israel, Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, it will strengthen the inferiority by law of the Arab minority when you are defining the state accepted by the Palestinian leadership as a Jewish state. To tell the truth, according to the Israeli basic law, before 20 years, Israel is being defined as a Jewish state. By the Israeli law, I do not accept it. I debate on it in the Knesset, in the parliament, in the press, in the media, all over. I may disagree with Danny Ben-Simon, who was a member of the Knesset in the Labour Party. The Labour Party accepted and supported and initiated the definition of Israel as a Jewish state. We disagree on that. But you cannot transfer this agreement for a debate with other countries, especially newly supposedly constructed countries. When we are talking about partners, let's see who is a partner, who is not a partner. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not a partner for the implementation of two-state solution. Notice, we all should notice that he had never used the words independent, sovereign Palestinian state. Never. He said Palestinian state, demilitarized Palestinian state, but never independent Palestinian state. It is important. I talked about the attack on an Arab village in the very beginning and mentioned the Arab minority in the definition of Israel as a Jewish state. Under this government, and the last government, but mainly this government, in the last weeks we are facing a flood of racist legislation against Arabs by this government. The last week, the ministerial committee, the government, approved two motions, two laws, yet not by the Knesset. One is saying that the Jewishness of the state is much more superior and important than the democratic aspect of the state, and that the Arab language, which is official these days, should downgrade it and should not be accepted as an official language. The second motion is to prefer all those who served in the army by employment, by scholarships, by universities, by all aspects of life, on those who did not. Those who did not. We, the Arab minority in Israel, we do not agree to serve in the army, and the state said, we don't want you to serve in the army for 50 years. There was a modus vivendi accepted by both. The second and more dangerous project these days we are facing as an Arab minority is what's called Brava land, to confiscate 800,000 dunams in the south, in the Negev, and to deport tens of thousands of Arab citizens from their houses and tents. It is the most dangerous plan for the last 40 years proposed by the government to be imposed in the Arab minority. That's why I am here to ask the international community, the United Nations, the committees responsible for minorities, to pay attention to the situation of the Arab minority as part of the Palestinian people, especially for this plan, Bravo plan, and to ask, to demand the Israeli government explanation, to put the pressure in order to deal with us as an equal citizens, and we are not. Israel is being described as the island of democracy in the Middle East. To say the truth, there are three systems of regimes being led by the Israeli government. One is pure democracy, only for the Jewish majority. That's why I am calling it ethnocracy. To say the truth, more Judocracy, democracy for Jews. The second led system is racial discrimination against 20% of the population, the Arab minority. The third rule and system is the apartheid and deepening the apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories in 1967. There are two systems of laws there. Military against Palestinians under occupation, and civil Israeli rules for settlers. There are separate roads preventing Palestinians from using these roads. 443 Street, for example, was confiscated from Palestinians and they are prevented from using it. Courts, there are military courts for Palestinians and civil courts for Jewish settlers. That's why this double standard should be stopped. Israel should not be above international law. Israel is violating bluntly the international law by dealing with the Palestinian under occupation. The occupation is not causing Israel in any aspect any price. More than that, in some aspect economically, Israel is gaining benefit from occupation. In the Jordan Valley area, Al-Ghor, yearly they are winning almost 1 million shekel, which is $300 million. Agriculture on Palestinian lands, occupied lands. If this situation will continue, why Prime Minister Netanyahu will obey to any effort of Secretary Kerry? He will continue to say that he has no partner, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, know well who is the no partner in the peace process. Thank you very much.
We express our deep appreciation for the presentation of Mr. TV. that we have the honor to welcome to his house, because he's the Deputy Director General of the Department of West Asia and North African Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. Thank you for having agreed to share with us your analysis on the situation facing Israelis and Palestinians. You have the floor, sir.
主席先生、女士们、先生们，很高兴出席联合国支持巴以和平国际会议，共同探讨如何促进巴以和平。1947年，联合国大会通过了巴勒斯坦的分治决议，以色列国随之建立。遗憾的是，60多年过去了，属于巴勒斯坦人的国家始终未能真正建立。 巴勒斯坦的许多土地仍被占领，巴勒斯坦人民的合法民族权利也未能得到恢复，这是导致巴以、阿以长期尖锐对立，难以实现和平的根源。纠正历史不公，赋予应有权利，既是解决巴勒斯坦问题的关键，也是国际社会的期盼。两国方案的核心就是实现巴勒斯坦独立建国，最终目标是巴以两国比邻而居，和睦相处。近2年来，中东地区形势发生重大变化，一定程度上冲淡了国际社会对巴勒斯坦问题的关注。但巴勒斯坦问题作为中东问题核心的地位没有改变。 解决这一问题对维护中东地区和平稳定的重要意义也没有改变。近期，国际社会加大促和力度，巴以双方也就恢复和谈表达了一定积极愿望，重启停滞已久的巴以和谈，推进两国方案面临重要契机。女士们、先生们，和平之路崎岖坎坷。 要想把美好愿望变成现实，为重启并推进和谈创造良好氛围，巴以双方和国际社会必须采取切实行动，消除前进中的障碍。中方认为，应该停止在巴勒斯坦备占领土，特别是东耶路撒冷新建、扩建定居点，停止强拆巴勒斯坦人房屋等行为。 停止任何单方面改变耶路撒冷现状的行为，切实尊重和保护耶路撒冷的宗教文化特性。应该停止一切针对平民的暴力活动。生存权和安全权是巴以人民都应享有的基本权利。事实一再证明，暴力只能带来仇恨。 和以暴易暴的恶性循环必须摒弃。巴以各派政治力量都应着眼于本国人民福祉和地区和平稳定的大局，坚持走和平谈判道路，通过对话而非对抗解决分歧。应该解除对加沙地带的封锁，尤其是放宽对食品、药品等生活必需品的准入。 缓解人道主义困境，并积极支持加沙经济重建，提高民众的生活水平，改善巴勒斯坦被关押者的人道待遇，释放被无辜关押者等问题也亟待解决。应该持续推进巴勒斯坦内部和解，只有巴勒斯坦各派团结一致，才能从根本上。 保障巴勒斯坦的统一和建国事业，也才能使巴以双方达成的任何和平协议得以真正落实。中方认为，解决好上述问题，将有助于为重启巴以和谈、实现两国方案创造条件。巴以双方，特别是处于强势地位的乙方，应该抓住当前有利时机，努力消除障碍。 相向而行，争取尽早重启并持续推进和谈。女士们、先生们，中国是最早支持巴勒斯坦民族解放事业、承认巴勒斯坦解放组织 和巴勒斯坦国的国家之一。中东和平进程启动后，中方坚定支持巴以和谈。近年来，中方对巴勒斯坦以国家身份加入联合国等国际组织予以积极支持。上个月，中方接待巴以领导人访华，习近平主席提出了中方关于解决巴勒斯坦问题的4点主张，明确支持建立以1967年边界为基础，以东耶路撒冷为首都，拥有完全主权的独立的巴勒斯坦国，实现巴以两国和平共处。4点主张特别强调，巴以双方都要采取切实措施，为重启和谈创造必要条件。主席先生、女士们、先生们，20年前奥斯陆协议的签署，扬起了巴以和平之舟前进的风帆。20年来，尽管历经风雨，但我们的航向始终不改。正如习近平主席在与阿巴斯总统会谈时所说：“艰难困苦，玉汝于成。只要巴以双方和国际社会始终坚持和平的大方向，并锲而不舍做出努力，就一定能够克服前进中的障碍，最终实现巴以人民、中国人民和世界人民的共同期盼。”谢谢大家。
We also extend our deep appreciation for the participation to Mr. Dinati. And now let us welcome our next speaker, Mr. Daniel Ben Simon. Mr. Ben Simon is a former member of the Knesset, where he represented the Labour Party. He also worked for more than a decade as a reporter and columnist of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Aside from being an award-winning journalist, he has written 4 books, 2 of which were turned into documentaries. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is an opportunity for me to congratulate Mr. Ahmed Tibi. He was voted yesterday by the Israeli Parliament to be Deputy Speaker, unanimously. Jews and Arabs voted for him, and it's a chance for me to say bravo. The second one is a confession. Personal confession. This is the 3rd time that the UN has had the gratitude to invite me. The first time was in Seville, 10 years ago. The second time in Morocco, Mr. Mansour. The 3rd time is now. Nothing has come out of the 2-state solution. I mean, there was no solution in the last 10 years, but in the first time I was invited, I met the woman who became my partner today. So there is I'm optimistic, but also something good came out from the UN invitation to the 2-state solution. And I must share with you the mood in Israel today. We have had elections 3 months ago, or 4 months ago. And for the first time in the history of Israel, the conflict was not on the agenda. Not the Israeli-Arab conflict and not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As if we lived in Switzerland, or in Norway, or in France. But in Israel, during 2 months, Tibi, correct me if I'm wrong, the world peace process was not pronounced, was not raised as if everything was well. And I, as the speaker mentioned, I was a journalist for 25 years. I wrote a few books about elections. It was always about the left and right wing. The left want a Palestinian state. The right wing would love to have the greater Israel. The issue did not exist this time. Israelis went to the elections on two issues. One is social equality. The rich and the poor became a major issue in Israel. 400,000 Israelis went to the streets to ask for more equality. So the elections were on how to take more from the rich and give more to the poor. And there was a second issue. What to do with the 15 or 20% ultra-Orthodox community. Have you heard about them? People who dress in black and are very religious. And there was a demand by the secular Israelis. Are they part of us or are they not part of us? Are they with us or against us? If they are with us, we demand that they go to the army. So one was social equality, the second was military service for all, except for the Israeli Arabs. So the last elections had nothing to do with the issue that we are discussing now. You can say escapism, you can say Israel is trying to be normal before signing an agreement, but that was something unbelievable. My party, which lost its prime minister on the peace process, Mr. Rabin was assassinated because he shook hands with Arafat. My party never mentioned a word about the peace process, as if the prime minister was killed twice. We raised the issue of the price of goods in supermarkets. Is it too expensive? Is it less expensive? What should we do? And the new leader of my party, a woman called Mrs. Yachimovich, never spoke about the peace process since she was elected 2 years ago. Amazing. And of course, these two issues were on top of everything. And that's why we are discussing about the new Israeli politics. The big winners are people who never raised the issue of peace. Not that they don't have an idea about peace, but it was not on the agenda. And I must tell you, it was something, maybe it came from the Arab Spring, maybe from Europe, but Israelis went to the streets also to demand equality. Not a Palestinian state, not to demand peace, not the end of occupation, but the end of occupation of the rich people. The rich became the enemy of Israel. One of them left lately Israel because he could not live with the idea that people hated him. Now he lives in London. So in a way, the mood in Israel is today, and still is since the elections, how to make Israeli society a more fair society, a more equal society. But I must say, to my regret, the issue of peace, 4 months after the elections, is still not there. President Obama came at last to Israel. He had a great 3 days, I must say. He was so happy. And then he left. He kissed everyone. But then he left. And we ask, what's left of his visit? Nothing. Since then, Mr. Kerry has been coming and going. And in the Israeli press, there's almost no mention. I mean, once, 2, 3, 4 years, 7 years ago, a visit by the Secretary of State would make headlines. Now you can find it in page 14 of the paper. Mr. Kerry was here. Sometimes he would not be in the newscast. This is the mood in Israel today. I'm here almost as a journalist, telling you how to read the Israeli mind today, and that's why Mr. Netanyahu was re-elected. Because his views on the Middle East, on the peace process, were not relevant to these elections. And that's why the party parties who spoke about peace, mainly Mrs. Livni, got so 6 mandates. She used to have 28 4 years ago. She got 6 now because she spoke about peace. And then people ask her, what about the prices in the supermarket? She had no good answer. So where are we heading today? There is no talk of the two-state solution. There are, of course, people from the right-wing party, and Mr. Tibi mentioned, who say the two-state solution is dead. But there are also no talk about the one-state solution. There are no talk at all. We are waiting. We are waiting. There's one person who speaks about peace, it's the Prime Minister. And this mysterious guy called Mr. Netanyahu never said that he's against peace, never said that he's against this two-state solution, but he did nothing to promote the two-state solution. He is Mr. Status Quo, and it fits the mood of the Israelis today. You cannot find a better person to reflect the mood of the Israelis than Mr. Netanyahu. Do nothing. Of course, he received Mr. Obama, he received Mr. Kerry, he speaks to the EU, he meets once in a while leaders, he goes to places, he visits a lot. But the peace process, who was the crown, the jewel in the crown of Israeli policies, is not there anymore. I used to go to meetings during my primaries. I would say something about the peace process, and I would see people saying, what about the economy? So this is the current mood. I don't know why, what happened. But just to tell you that the Israelis are maybe escaping something. They don't want to talk about this. And yesterday the budget was voted. There were cuts in all departments of the Israeli life, except one. Tibi, do you know which one? No, settlements. Nobody touched the settlements. And there was no argument about it. My party didn't vote no motion, no confidence vote. The settlements budget, notice that it is intact. It has more, I think $4 billion more, and not a word. Which tells you that there is nothing that will take the Israelis to the street on the peace process. And that doesn't mean that the Israelis don't have a view. I think that the Israelis would vote 70% for anything. We would have 70%. Peace, 70%. Leave the West Bank, 70%. Leave the Jerusalem, dividing Jerusalem, 70%. But also for war, you will have 70%. You have 70% for, in order to understand Israelis, for the big thing, you have 70% for anything. So if you give them peace, they will vote in big majority, 70%. But if you go to Gaza once again, you will get 70%. So the mood today, if you want to make peace, this is the right time. But if you want to go to, to Syria, to visit militarily, you will have also 70%. And what should be done? I must tell you that after so many years of talking about peace process, there is a sense that maybe TV mentioned it. Sorry, Deputy Speaker TV. I'm so sorry. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Ahmed Tibi, said about the price. The last 5 years have been very quiet. Life in Israel is good. And there's a sense of normalcy. There's no intifada, there's no war. And I would say that the Israelis are turning into their own problems. The problems with religion. What to do with religious people. This is something we evaded for 65 years. In order to get married, you have to go to see the rabbis. But I'm a secular guy. In order to divorce, you have to wait 2 years and to see the rabbis, who, they're not my cup of tea. And the Israelis are now dealing with their own problems. and if you, by chance, marry twice or 3 times like me, you have to go to see the rabbis more than once. It's not fun. So the Israelis now did it about themselves on religion, identity, and everything. The peace process is not there. So I would say that eventually, since the Americans are not there, since Mr. Kerry put an ultimatum to the Israelis, either you have 2 states or 1 state. I would finish with this. It seems to me that Israelis and Palestinians are not really eager to divorce. And maybe the natural thing that is going on today, living together in a peaceful way, maybe this will bring a victory to those in Israel, to those in Palestine who would like to live together without having 2 states. And eventually it will become 1 state. And the main question that remains today, what will be with the Israeli democracy? Will they be given the right to vote or not? So today it's becoming an issue, not to have a Palestinian state, but will they vote if they become Israeli citizens? So I see less and less eagerness, and I finish with it, less and less eagerness to divorce, and more tendency to stay together. The only issue is the image and the law, and will the Palestinians get the rights, the same rights as the Jews? And what will happen in 20 or 30 years? Will it become, with the birthright rate of the Palestinians, will it become a Palestinian state? Will it remain Jewish? So now we are discussing the modalities of 1 state, without calling it 1 state. How is it to live together? I don't see today anyone who is ready and able politically to cut this state of Palestine or Eretz Israel, how you call it, in 2. I don't see one here today. So in a way, the status quo leads to one thing. We're going to stay together and live together. The question is how. Thank you very much.
We also extend our deep appreciation for the presentation of Ben Simon. I think that has been very interesting. I think that it's clear that you are a good journalist. On behalf of the committee, we would like to express our appreciation for your presentation. Now, I think that we can take a 10 minutes break. That is going to be a short coffee break, and we shall reconvene in 10 minutes. Please have the coffee break. No. Sure, we are going to continue later on. There is another guest that is going to be important speaker. Don't think that for you are in the second part, you are not going to be at the same level of importance. But I think that it's going to be better than anyone have a coffee break that is going to be prepared to be actively involved with listening.